There's a sound you don't forget. Not the blast of a rail cannon, not the hiss of a ship breaking atmosphere, not even the low, grinding moan of a city dying in slow collapse. Those sounds you learn to file away. You build a shelf in your head and you stack them there, one after another, until the shelf is full and you stop noticing. But a child screaming in the dark, that one never makes it to the shelf. That one stays on the floor, right in the middle of everything. You keep stepping around it, keep pretending you didn't hear it, and it just sits there, waiting for a quiet moment to climb back up your throat. I heard it on a Tuesday. 43rd cycle of the Outer Rim deployment, 3rd hour of a patrol shift. I was running half asleep, one boot perpetually looser than the other, because the left magnetic clasp had been broken since Kellara Station and nobody in supply seemed to care. The air in Sector 12 smelled like rain that never actually fell, that copper, almost sweet smell that hits right before the pressure drops. The kind of weather that makes your joints ache and your mind wander to places it shouldn't go. I was walking the perimeter of what the maps called the Old Borough, which was a polite way of saying the part of the city that the rebuilding effort had quietly agreed to forget. Buildings still standing, but only just. Streets that used to carry trams now carrying nothing but silence and the occasional skitter of something small between the rubble. Most nights you didn't see anyone out there. The civilian relocation orders had cleared most of the borough out 3 years ago, and the ones who'd stayed had made a profession of not being seen. So when I heard the screaming, I stopped walking. Just stopped mid-step, my boot heel half lifted off the cracked pavement. Because it was small. The scream, high and breathless and coming from somewhere off the main path, somewhere between two collapsed walls that had leaned together at the top like they were sharing a secret. And it wasn't the scream of someone being surprised or startled or even hurt in the way that wounds hurt. It was the scream of something cornered, something that had understood the situation fully and had no more options left. I had my sidearm out before I'd consciously decided to move. That happens sometimes. The body makes a decision and tells your brain about it afterward. Training, they call it. I prefer to think of it as the part of you that's still animal, the part that lived through long enough generations of being prey to know when something innocent is in danger. I moved toward the sound. The alley between the two walls was barely wide enough for a person sideways. Old borough architecture. The buildings had been constructed before the settlement regulations, back when people were still figuring out what habitation looked like on a world that wasn't Earth. They'd built close. Tight, as if proximity to other walls meant safety, even if those walls belonged to strangers. I squeezed through and came out the other side into a small courtyard, maybe 10 meters across. Used to be a community gathering space from the looks of it. There was the rusted skeleton of what might have been a water feature in the center, a few broken benches, some kind of decorative mosaic on the ground now half buried under debris. And in the far corner, 4 of them. I knew them from the gear before I could make out faces. The compressed light harnesses, the UV emitters strapped to their forearms, the portable kind that could flood a 10-meter radius with enough ultraviolet to blister stone. The modified restraint cuffs with the silver core filament. None of this was standard issue anything. This was equipment that cost money and required knowledge to source, the kind of equipment that a certain type of person acquires specifically for a certain type of work. The Hunters didn't have a formal name. There were a few different groups operating across the Outer Rim by then, with different philosophies, different funding structures, different levels of organization. But the work was the same. Find the Vethara. Find where they nested, where they moved, where they sheltered their young, and remove them. Vethara, the word the settlers had invented for them, the beings who had already been on this world when humanity arrived. The ones who had retreated to the old structures, the deep places, the dark corners of the planet that humans had initially dismissed as uninhabitable. The ones who looked, at first glance, disturbingly close to human, until you noticed the stillness, the way their eyes caught light at the wrong angles, the way they didn't breathe quite the way anything should breathe. The ones who had learned, over centuries of coexistence with whatever this world held, to feed from the ambient bioelectric field of living organisms rather than direct blood contact. A fact that exactly none of the hunters in that courtyard cared about, because that level of nuance doesn't fit on a threat assessment form. They called them vampires, it was easier. And in the corner of that courtyard, backed against a wall that had nowhere further to give, was a Vethara child. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 by human reckoning. Small even for a child, dark hair that caught the dim sensor light from my helmet in a way that looked almost silver. Eyes wide and luminous in the dark, the way Vethara eyes went when they were afraid, the bioluminescent reflex, an involuntary response their kind couldn't suppress under stress. Her clothes were torn, the kind of tearing that happens when someone grabs at you and you run. Her hands were pressed flat against the wall behind her, and she was shaking so hard I could see it from across the courtyard. One of the hunters had his UV emitter pointed directly at her. The light was on low, not enough to damage, not yet, but enough to make the Vethara skin react. The child's forearms were already showing the early reddening. Her scream had dropped to a sound that was worse than screaming, a low, sustained keening, like she'd already exhausted the part of herself that could be loud. "Put it down," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. That's another thing training does, separates your voice from your stomach. The 4 hunters turned. The one with the emitter was a big man. Broad through the shoulders, a scar running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth that had healed badly, probably because he'd refused treatment. He had the look of someone who had decided, a long time ago, that the world only made sense when sorted into 2 categories, and he'd built his entire identity around maintaining that sorting system. "Corporal," he said, "not sir, not even soldier, just the rank flat like reading a label." I said, "Put it down. This isn't perimeter business." "The old borough is inside my patrol zone," I said, "so right now everything in it is my business." One of the others shifted, moving, I realized, to angle around my left. Flanking. Not subtle. Either they didn't care whether I noticed or they wanted me to notice, wanted to see how I'd respond to the pressure. I moved my sidearm to cover the man with the emitter. Center mass, clean line. "The one who's about to get shot is you," I told him. "Not the one trying to be clever on my left." The flanking man stopped. "You know what that is?" the big man asked. He gestured toward the child with his chin like she wasn't even worth a full directional movement. "You know what they do, you know what they are." "I know what a child looks like," I said. "And I know what it looks like when one is cornered and terrified. And I know that whatever problem you have with her species is not something that gets solved tonight in this courtyard with her." She was feeding from a civilian 2 blocks over. "Was she witnessed 3 accounts? Then you can take your 3 accounts to a magistrate and file a formal complaint and let the actual authorities determine what happened." "The actual authorities," he repeated, and the way he said it made it clear what he thought of that category and of me for belonging to it. "You know what the actual authorities do with Vethara cases. They sit on them. They lose the paperwork. They reassign the investigators to somewhere else." I didn't have an answer for that because it wasn't entirely wrong, and he knew it. The bureaucratic reality of Vethara human relations in the Outer Rim in those years was not something anyone was proud of. Cases fell through cracks. Investigations stalled. There were politics involved that started several levels above my pay grade and trickled down in ways that made everyone below those levels feel complicit in something they couldn't fully name. But none of that, none of the institutional failure, none of the political complexity, none of the legitimately tangled history between 2 species trying to share a world that neither fully understood. None of that was this child's problem to solve with her body and her fear and her burned arms. "Lower the emitter," I said, "or I fire your call." The big man looked at me for a long moment, assessing, calculating. People like him, people who have organized their entire sense of self around a project, don't back down easily because backing down requires conceding that the project has limits. And the project for him didn't have limits, or wasn't supposed to. But he could also do math. 4 against 1, yes. But I had the angle on him and I had my hand steady, and I had exactly the expression on my face that I'd been told more than once, made it unclear whether I was bluffing. I wasn't bluffing. He must have decided after the calculations that I wasn't. He lowered the emitter. Not all the way, not with any grace, but down. "This isn't over," he said. "None of it ever is," I agreed. They left through the same gap I'd come through. Single file. The flanking man last, turning back once to look at me with an expression I filed away in the category of things to keep peripheral awareness of going forward. Then they were gone and the courtyard was just the courtyard again. The rusted water feature, the broken benches, the half-buried mosaic. And the child was still pressed against the far wall, still shaking, still making that low sound that was worse than screaming. I holstered the sidearm. "Hey," I said, quietly, from across the courtyard, not moving closer yet. You learn, working the outer rim, that closing distance fast on a frightened Vethara is how you find out exactly how efficient their defensive reflexes are. "Hey, it's okay. They're gone." The luminous eyes found me, tracked me. "I'm not going to hurt you," I said, which felt inadequate and was probably inadequate, but was also the only thing I had to offer right then. "You understand me? Can you understand me?" A pause, then a small, jerky nod. She slid down the wall very slowly until she was sitting on the courtyard floor, knees pulled up, arms wrapped around them, face tucked down. The shaking didn't stop, but it changed frequency, became less violent, more continuous. The kind of shaking that follows adrenaline rather than fear. I crossed the courtyard and sat down too, not next to her, a few meters away. On the ground, back against an adjacent section of wall, sidearm still holstered, making it clear as clearly as I could without speaking it explicitly that I was not a threat and had no agenda beyond being present until the shaking stopped. We sat like that for a while. Above us, the sky was doing its outer rim thing, neither dark nor light, that strange perpetual gray-blue that came from the twin moons being out, and the atmospheric particulates catching and diffusing the light into something that looked like permanent early morning. It was the thing visitors to the outer rim mentioned most. The sky. How it never quite committed to night. "They burned you," I said eventually, not accusing, just noting. She looked at her arms. The redness was already starting to fade. Vethara healing ran fast, faster than most human injury would allow, though the UV burns would leave a residual ache for longer. She pulled the sleeves of her torn shirt down over her wrists. "Where do you live?" I asked. "Is there someone I can take you to?" "Nothing." Either she didn't know or wasn't telling me. "Okay," I said. "That's okay, you don't have to tell me that." More silence. Then very quietly, in the Vethara-accented standard that always sounded slightly too precise, like someone who'd learned a language from a text rather than from conversation. "You fired at them." I pointed my weapon at them. "Same thing." "Not quite, but close." "Why?" she asked. It was a real question, not rhetorical, not challenging. She genuinely wanted to know, in the way that children ask questions when they're trying to make a world make sense, because the world they'd been given up to that point didn't. "Because they were going to hurt you," I said. "Yes," she said, "but why did that matter to you?" I thought about that for a moment. The honest answer was complicated in a way that I didn't have the words for right then, sitting on a courtyard floor in the old borough at 3 in the morning. Something about the shelf in my head, and the sounds that never made it onto it. Something about the fact that I'd been on the wrong side of a power differential once, a long time ago, in a way that had nothing to do with vampires or soldiers or alien worlds, and had never quite lost the instinct to recognize that look on a face. "Doesn't matter," I said finally. "You're safe now, that's enough." She considered this. Then, with the solemn gravity that children sometimes bring to statements that adults have learned to make casually, "Thank you." "You're welcome." I filed an incident report when I got back to the post. Detailed everything, the hunters, the equipment, the UV exposure, the confrontation. The report went up the chain and, as far as I ever saw, stayed there. The big man with the scar, whose name I eventually tracked down as Brennan Crast, filed a counter-complaint alleging interference with a lawful civilian operation. That complaint also went somewhere up the chain and presumably sat beside my report in whatever digital filing structure handled things people didn't want to deal with. I went back on patrol the next night. And the night after that. And nothing happened. For about 11 days. The weight of what you didn't choose. The thing about the old borough was that it had a rhythm once you learned it. Not the rhythm of a living place, nothing that organized or intentional. More like the rhythm of weather. Patterns that repeated not because anything was orchestrating them, but because the underlying conditions consistently produced the same results. The skitters of debris movement at certain hours, always from the northeast. The distant rumble of the automated transport grid that ran under the city and occasionally misfired, sending a vibration up through the earth. The pale glow that appeared somewhere deep in the network of partially collapsed structures around cycle hour 4. Never in the same exact spot, but always from the same general direction. That glow, I'd figured out early on, was Vethera. Their bioluminescence was involuntary. I mentioned that about the child, the way fear triggered it. But what most human soldiers didn't know, because nobody had bothered to put it in the briefings, was that it wasn't only fear that triggered it. Calm did too. Deep calm, the kind that a person might reach in meditation or prayer or a particular kind of exhausted peace. The Vethara didn't sleep the way humans slept, but they had a rest state, and in that rest state their bioluminescence ran slow and steady and warm, like embers rather than flame. I'd seen it 3 times during my patrols, that soft glow from the northeast section of the burrow. Never identified exactly where. Never tried too hard because that felt like an intrusion I hadn't earned the right to make. But I knew they were there, and after what happened with the child, I had a feeling that they knew I was there too. On the 12th night, I found something on one of the broken benches in that same courtyard. A small cloth pouch, the drawstring pulled tight, placed precisely in the center of the bench closest to where I usually turned at the end of the patrol loop. Inside, 7 small polished stones, each one a different color, each one smooth in a way that suggested handling rather than natural erosion. No note, no explanation. I stood there for a minute, holding the pouch open, looking at the stones. Then I put them back, cinched the drawstring, and put the pouch in my chest pocket. I still have it. 5 of the original 7 stones. I lost 2 in the relocation, somewhere between Calera Station and the transport that took me off the outer rim 8 months later. But 5 of them are in a small box on my workstation right now, alongside some other things I kept from those years. And every time I look at them, I think about the child pressed against the wall and the question she asked me. Why did that matter to you? I still don't have a complete answer, but I've had a long time to work on it. The confrontation with Brennan Krast happened again on night 17. Not in the courtyard, in the open street, 3 blocks further in, which was either a tactical choice or a territorial one. He came with 6 people this time, not 3, and 2 of them were carrying equipment I recognized as belonging to a class of Vethara suppression hardware that was technically legal under Outer Rim trade statutes, but had been flagged by 3 different ethics review boards as having no use case that didn't involve large-scale harm. I was on patrol alone, standard assignment. The Outer Rim command was spread thin across half a dozen deployment zones, and the old burrow, being officially abandoned, got single-soldier rotations on the assumption that there was nothing there worth multiple bodies. Krast didn't bother with the courteous use of my rank this time. "Walk away," he said. "Go back to your post, say you saw nothing. We're not asking for your involvement." "You're in my patrol zone," I said. "By definition, anything you do here is my involvement. Your patrol zone is a formality for a city sector that's been condemned for 18 months. Nobody lives here. Nobody's supposed to live here." And yet, he said it with the weariness of someone who'd been having this argument for a long time with themselves and was tired of how it ended. "You know what they are, Corporal. You've been on the Outer Rim long enough. You know the reports. The bioelectric feeding, yes, the contact feeding is rare, yes, most of them have adapted. But the ones in this burrow, the ones hiding in the old structures, they haven't. They're the old bloodline, the ones who didn't make the adaptation. And they are feeding from civilians. The child you protected, she'd been feeding from a 16-year-old human 3 blocks from here. I heard that claim before. I also heard that it was 3 witnesses, which in my experience means 3 people who know each other and have a reason to say the same thing. What would convince you? Evidence I could actually verify. The magistrate system is compromised. So bring it somewhere that isn't. Where there is nowhere that isn't, not on the Outer Rim, you know this. You've been here long enough. I did know it. That was the terrible thing. I knew it the same way I knew the shelf in my head was getting full, the same way I knew the left magnetic clasp on my boot was never getting fixed. The institutional reality of the Outer Rim was what it was. The question wasn't whether I could fix it. The question was what I did inside of it. "I'm not going to let you take anyone tonight," I said, "or any other night while I'm on this patrol." Krast looked at me for a long moment. The 6 people behind him were still, professionally still, the stillness of people who have been told to wait and know how to do it. You know what happens to soldiers who develop sympathies, he said. You know how that's read by command. I know how things are read, I said. I also know the difference between sympathy and a legal obligation to not allow unlawful harm in my patrol zone. Is it unlawful? He said. Find me the statute. Section 47 of the Outer Rim Settlement Code, I said. Protection from persecution on basis of species designation, with explicit applicability to non-aggressive Vethara populations as designated under the designation that's been under review for 8 months and is expected to be stripped. Expected isn't the same as done. He stared at me. I stared back. Something moved, somewhere in the rubble above and to the northeast, a sound small like a single careful footstep taken on unstable ground by something very practiced at being quiet. Krast heard it too. His eyes moved in that direction, and for a moment something passed across his face that was older than strategy. Something that lived in the hindbrain, beneath the logic of the project and the equipment and the legal gray areas. Fear. He recognized what was in those ruins, had maybe more information about what was in those ruins than I did. This will be the last time, he said. Not a threat exactly, more like a statement about the nature of resources and timelines. We'll have the designation stripped and a commission order in place inside of a month. After that, there's no Section 47 to hide behind. After that, what you do in this patrol zone is obstruction of a lawful order. After that, I said, we'll deal with after that. They left again. Less cleanly this time, not single file, more of a loose group retreat, Krast last, watching me the whole way until the broken walls swallowed them. I stood in the street for a while after they'd gone. Above me, the sky was doing its perpetual early morning thing. The distant rumble of the transport grid rose and fell, and from somewhere in the northeast, from somewhere in the layered dark of the old Burrow ruins, I saw very briefly the slow warm glow of Vethara bioluminescence. Not the hot white of fear, the ember-slow light of recognition. I nodded toward it, which was probably ridiculous. Then I finished my patrol and went back to the post. She was standing in the middle of the patrol path when I came around the eastern corner on night 23. Just standing there, in the open, which no Vethara I'd encountered in the Burrow ever did. In the direct line of my helmet sensor light, which no creature that understood what sensor light meant would voluntarily walk into. Standing with both hands slightly away from her body, the universally understood gesture, across every species and culture I'd ever encountered. That means I am not holding anything, and I am choosing to show you that. I stopped. She didn't move. For a moment, I just took in the visual information, which is what training says to do, what the part of your brain that isn't your hindbrain insists is the correct response. Visual information, assessment, classification, response determination. She was tall, taller than any Vethara I'd seen in the Burrow, who tended toward the compact build that the old bloodline apparently favored. She had the luminous quality that Vethara carried even when their bioluminescence wasn't active, that particular quality of their skin that seemed to hold ambient light rather than reflect it, like something between glass and water. Her hair was dark, but with an undertone that in the sensor light looked almost purple. She was dressed in clothing that was unmistakably not Burrow clothing, not the worn, patched, functional layering of people living in condemned structures, but something that had been designed and constructed with intention. Clean lines, dark material, the kind of clothing that in a human context would have read as formal without being ceremonial. Her eyes were doing the thing that Vethara eyes do when they're calm but alert, not the bright luminosity of fear or the amber glow of rest, but the reflective silver that sits between those two states. The state of someone who is watchful and has decided to be seen watching. Corporal Darian Voss, she said. My name in perfect standard, with the Vethara precision of diction, but none of the studied carefulness of someone who'd learned it from text. This was someone who had spoken standard for a long time, in many contexts, with many different kinds of people. Yes, I said. I'd like to speak with you. I'm noticing that. The smallest possible alteration in her expression, not quite amusement, something adjacent to it. May I, she asked. You're standing in the middle of the path, I said. I think the initiative is already yours. This time it was amusement, clearly, brief but real. My name is Kalindra Vethsaren, she said. I am a coherence advocate for the Vethara Accord, specifically for the territories designated under Outer Rim Settlement jurisdiction. I have been aware of your patrols in the Old Borough for some time. I figured someone had been. I was not here, personally, until 3 days ago. I came when I received the report about the incident on Night 17. The confrontation with Krast. The confrontation during which you cited Section 47 verbatim. She paused. Correctly, I should add. Including the specific applicability clause, which most human legal practitioners omit. I had some reading time on the transfer ship. Yes, she said, in a tone that suggested she'd read my file and knew exactly how I'd spent the transfer ship, and that reading time was a generous framing. I lowered my weapon. I'd had it out, half-raised, which I'd been maintaining as an open acknowledgement of the strangeness of the situation rather than an active threat. She hadn't reacted to it at all, which either meant she wasn't threatened by it or had chosen, strategically, not to appear to be. The child, I said, she's all right. Something shifted in Kailindra Vethsaren's expression. Shifted towards something that was not quite soft, because her entire bearing was built around not being soft, but towards something genuine, something that had bypassed the formal architecture. Her name is Thessaly, she said. She is recovering. The burns. They will heal, they are healed mostly. A pause. She told me what you did, what you said. I didn't respond to that. She asked me why a human soldier would risk his posting for a Vethara child, Kailindra continued. I told her I wasn't certain, but that I was going to find out. And here you are. And here I am. We stood in the patrol path looking at each other. Above us, the perpetual gray-blue sky. Below us, the cracked pavement with its half-buried mosaic patterns visible at the edges, the city showing its older self through the fractures of the newer one. I'm going to keep walking my patrol, I said. You can walk with me if you want to talk. She fell into step beside me without hesitation. I noticed this in the first few minutes, and kept noticing it through the conversation, precisely calibrated in her movement. Not in the way that suggested performance or surveillance training, but in the way that suggested someone who had spent a very long time in situations where the wrong movement meant the wrong kind of attention. Every footfall placed with quiet certainty. Every turn of the body pre-planned, never abrupt, never reactive. The movement of someone who had been careful for so long that carefulness had become native to them, indistinguishable from personality. The Accord has been watching Krast's group for 6 months, she told me as we walked. They have significant backing from off-world interests. There are resources involved that go beyond a passionate ideological project. Commercial. Partially, there are also political dimensions. The designation review that Krast mentioned, the Section 47 applicability, that is not simply a bureaucratic process. It is being driven by parties who have a material interest in the old borough land. I thought about the mosaic under the debris, the water feature skeleton, the close-built walls that had been someone's idea of community. The borough, I said. Approximately 200 hectares of unredeveloped land in the middle of an expanding settlement corridor, she said. Currently inaccessible for commercial development because of the protected status of the Vethara population that resides there. Remove the protected status, remove the population, legally or otherwise, and 200 hectares become available. And someone profits. Several someones, in significant amounts. I absorbed this. You're telling me this because you think I need to understand the full picture. I'm telling you this because the encounter on Night 17 was not a random escalation. Krast's group is operating on an accelerated timeline. The designation review is moving faster than we initially projected. We believe they have inside access. She let that sit for a moment. We believe there are approximately 11 days before the designation is formally stripped and Section 47 no longer applies. 11 days. At which point, what you are doing, patrolling this sector, citing legal protections, becomes obstruction on your end and unobstructed access on theirs. I kept walking. We'd reached the point in the loop where the path turned north along the old transit wall, the long, straight section where the sensor light from the helmet didn't have to bounce off multiple surfaces, and you could see further than usual. It was the part of the patrol that felt most like an exposure, most like being visible from all the angles you couldn't monitor simultaneously. "What does the Accord want from me?" I said. "The Accord wants several things that are not your problem," she said. "What I want, specifically, is 12 days. 12. One more than Krast's timeline. Time for a filing I'm preparing to reach the Settlement Council before the designation review can be finalized." "What kind of filing?" "A full documentation of the evidence of coordinated unlawful activity targeting a protected population," she said, "including the commercial motivation, including the inside access to the review process. If it reaches the Council with complete documentation, the review is frozen pending investigation. The designation is maintained, and Section 47 continues to apply. And if it doesn't reach the Council, then it doesn't matter what Krast's timeline is, because the outcome will be the same regardless." We walked for a while in silence. I was doing math I didn't entirely know how to do, calculating the gap between 12 days of something that might now technically qualify as obstruction, and the filing that either would or wouldn't change the legal landscape I was operating in. Calculating how much of what I'd already done could be characterized as sympathies rather than duty. Calculating what Krast had meant when he'd said, "You know what happens to soldiers who develop sympathies." "You're asking me to keep doing what I'm already doing," I said. "For 12 more days," she said. "Yes. And if something happens in those 12 days, if Krast escalates again, if the situation becomes larger than a patrol confrontation." For the first time, something in her posture shifted. Not much, but enough to register. "Then I would be here," she said. Something about the way she said that was different from a reassurance. It wasn't, "Don't worry, you'll have backup." It was quieter than that, more specific. It had the sound of a decision that had already been made in advance, unilaterally, in a room I hadn't been invited into. I looked at her sideways. In the sensor light, her eyes were doing the watchful silver thing. "Who are you?" I said. "Actually, not the title." "I'm a coherence advocate," she said. "Right, and that title in Vethara culture, that means what exactly?" A pause, we kept walking. "It has several translations," she said finally. "The one most humans settle on is advocate. The literal meaning from Old Vethara is closer to one who walks beside." "One who walks beside," I repeated. "Yes." I thought about Thessaly asking me why it mattered. I thought about the stones in the cloth pouch, smooth from handling. I thought about the amber glow in the ruins. 12 days, I said. 12 days, she agreed. We finished the patrol loop in something that wasn't quite silence and wasn't quite conversation. The comfortable middle space between them, where you're aware of another person without needing to speak to maintain the awareness. When we reached the point where I turned back toward the post, she stopped walking. "Corporal Voss," she said. I turned. "The child asked me why it mattered to you," she said. I told her I wasn't certain. "You mentioned that." "I'm telling you now," she said, "that whatever the reason, it was the correct choice." She said it with the formal precision of someone delivering an official statement, but her eyes were doing something different from the watchful silver, something warmer. Something that the formal precision of the delivery couldn't quite contain. I nodded. She turned and walked into the dark of the burrow, and the dark folded around her like it had been waiting. And then she was simply gone, the way things that know a darkness well enough go from visible to invisible without any intermediate state. I stood there for another moment. Then I went back to the post and filed a completely standard patrol report that mentioned nothing unusual. She came back on night 24. Not dramatically, not standing in the path. She simply appeared at the eastern corner as I was coming around it, walking parallel to me about 3 meters to the left, which was the distance I'd come to understand over the following nights that she maintained when she was present but not specifically needing to communicate. The distance that said, "I see you, you see me," that's enough for now. The filing she was preparing was complex. She told me pieces of it over those nights, not in a structured way, not in a way that felt like briefing, but in the way that someone tells you things when they're turning them over themselves, when the articulation is part of the working through. The documentation of Krast's funding sources, which had required access to financial records that the Accord had spent 18 months building the legal mechanism to obtain. The documentation of the inside access. The identity of the person within the settlement, authorities' legal division who had been feeding the review process information about when to push and how far, which she was careful not to name to me. Careful not to put information in my possession that could technically constitute a security liability for someone else. "You're protecting me," I said on night 26. "I'm being careful," she said. Same thing in this context. The not quite amusement again. She told me about the burrow, the actual history of it, not the settlement map's version. The Vethara who had been living in those structures had been there for longer than the settlement itself, had retreated there from the inner city over the course of 3 separate waves of human expansion, each time moving further into what was, at that time, considered undesirable. The mosaic in the courtyard where I'd found Thessaly had been laid by Vethara hands, originally a navigational marker, a way of indicating to their own people that the space was a gathering node. The human builders who'd come later had preserved it by accident, building around it without understanding what it was. She was born in that courtyard, Kalindra told me on night 28, Thessaly. The family uses it as a shelter during the warm season. I thought about Thessaly backed against the wall, arms burned, voice gone to a keening. "Does she know about the filing?" I asked. "She knows we're working on something." "Does she know what it depends on?" A pause. "She knows," Kalindra said, "that a human soldier who didn't have to do anything chose to. She knows that we have an ally in a situation where allies are not common." "I'm not an ally," I said before I could stop myself. "I'm a soldier doing my patrol." "Yes," she said, quietly, in the tone that meant she understood exactly what I was doing and why I was framing it that way and was choosing to let me keep the framing. The nights fell into a rhythm that I would have found difficult to explain to anyone else, and in fact did find difficult to explain. The one time the post commander asked me why my patrol reports were consistently so clean in a zone that had recently flagged 2 significant incidents. I told him the situation had stabilized. He looked at me with the expression of someone who suspects more is happening than is being said, and has calculated that asking directly is more expensive than allowing it. He didn't ask directly. Kalindra and I walked the patrol loop most nights, or parts of it. Sometimes she disappeared for a night work, she said, on the filing, on communications with the Accord's Settlement Council contacts, on the increasingly complex logistics of getting the documentation to the right people before the wrong clock ran out. On those nights I walked alone and the burrow felt different, not less safe exactly, just less witnessed. Night 31. Krast came with 12 people and 2 portable UV array platforms. The arrays were mounted on small mobile units that could be directed remotely, and each one could flood a significantly larger area than the handheld emitters. The kind of equipment you brought when you'd stopped wanting to intimidate and started wanting to accomplish. He also brought a legal notice, printed on settlement authority letterhead, which meant either the designation review had accelerated beyond Kalindra's projections or the inside contact had moved to the next phase. "Provisional operational clearance," he said, holding the document out. "The designation review entered provisional phase this morning. Section 47 applicability is suspended during provisional review, pending final determination. We have legal authority to conduct a clearing operation in the old borough effective immediately." I looked at the document. Settlement authority letterhead was correct. The provisional phase language was correct. The operational clearance format was correct. "This is 6 days ahead of your own timeline," I said. "The process moved faster than expected." "Or was moved." He didn't bother denying it. He didn't need to. The document was real enough for the purpose he was putting it to. I had my weapon out. The 6 days was a problem I didn't have a solution for in the 15 seconds I had to find one. The filing wasn't ready. The council contact hadn't been reached. Everything that was supposed to happen in 6 more days hadn't happened. "Corporal," Krast said, and his voice had changed, had lost the flat confrontation and acquired something almost regretful, the tone of someone who genuinely hoped things would resolve differently. "This is a lawful order under provisional settlement authority. If you interfere, that's documented obstruction. That ends your posting, your service record. I'm not threatening you. I'm being accurate about what the paperwork says." I believed him about the paperwork. Give me an hour, I said. In hours? 1 hour. I'm requesting time to verify the validity of the clearance through my command chain. That's standard procedure for any document presented in the field. He calculated. 1 hour, he said. He and the 12 people and the 2 UV arrays pulled back to the far end of the street, not leaving, establishing a waiting position, a courtesy or the appearance of one. I turned and Kalindra was already there. Not walking toward me from the ruins, already beside me, as if she'd been standing at the edge of my peripheral vision for the last 3 minutes, and I'd simply not registered it until I turned. She had her hand extended. In it, a small communication device of a type I didn't recognize, Vethara tech, more compact and more sophisticated than the standard-issue communicator on my belt, with an encryption layer you could see in the way its surface refused to catch the light properly. 3 council contacts, she said quietly. All verified as uncorrupted. The filing is complete. All it needs is transmission. Now, the provisional phase creates a window. It's not a full suspension. There's a challenge mechanism, a 48-hour hold period if a council member files for review. If even one of those 3 contacts files before the provisional phase becomes final, the holding mechanism applies and we get the 48 hours. And in 48 hours, the full filing reaches the open council record. Once it's in the open record, the inside access is exposed, the commercial motivation is documented, and the provisional clearance becomes the thing under scrutiny rather than the designation. I took the device. She said, the transmission goes to all 3 simultaneously. The encryption will route it through pathways that cannot be intercepted by the same systems that moved the provisional phase forward. You've been ready for this, I said. I've been ready for several scenarios, she said, including the one where they moved early. Of course you have. Something crossed her expression, not the not-quite amusement, not the formal precision. Something more direct than either. Something that had decided in this particular moment to not be managed. Corporal Voss, she said, Darian, I want you to understand something before you do this. All right. What I am asking you to do, transmitting this in the field, while under a direct provisional authority order, that is not a small thing. The document crashed as may be manufactured or accelerated by corrupt means, but it will read as real long enough to cause real consequences for you. The obstruction charge will be filed. The investigation will take time. Your posting will be affected. I know. I'm not saying this to dissuade you. I'm saying it because you should be making this choice with complete information, and the complete information includes the part that costs you something. I know, I said again. She looked at me for a moment, the watchful silver eyes. Why, she asked. And there it was, the same question Thessaly had asked from the courtyard floor. The same real question, not rhetorical, not challenging, not cynical. Just the genuine need to understand why a world that had taught them to expect one thing kept, occasionally, producing another. I thought about the shelf, about the sounds that never made it there. Because 11 days ago you asked me to do a thing, I said. And I said yes, and I don't not do things I said yes to. It wasn't the full answer. It probably wasn't the true answer, or not the whole true answer. But it was the answer I had that fit into the 60 seconds I had to have it in. She nodded once slowly. I pressed the transmission. The device sent to all 3 simultaneously, the routing paths flickering through encryption layers that looked in the tiny display like something living. Then it was done. The device showed 3 confirmation receipts, one after another, each with a timestamp. 17 seconds later, the first council contact filed for review. Then the second. Then the third. Kalindra was watching the confirmations come through. Her expression did something I hadn't seen it do before, something that was not quite relief, because relief implied that failure had been genuinely possible, and she seemed constitutionally opposed to acknowledging that, but something adjacent. Something that lived just underneath the formal architecture and surfaced now, briefly, because the situation warranted it. The holding mechanism is in effect, she said. Go tell Krast. She looked at me, that's. Your job, I said. I'll stand here, you go tell him. Another pause. Then she walked down the street toward where Krast and the 12 people and the 2 UV arrays were waiting, and I watched her cross the distance with those precisely calibrated steps, and I thought about what it means to walk beside something. To choose to stand in a particular place, in a particular relationship to another person, not because you were assigned there, but because you looked at the situation and decided that was where you needed to be. I couldn't hear the conversation from where I was standing. I watched the body language. I watched Krast take something on his own communicator, the council filing notifications, presumably coming through on whatever official channels he was monitoring. I watched his posture shift, not dramatically but definitively, the way a structure shifts when a load-bearing element changes. He didn't leave immediately. He made some point to Kalindra, who listened with the precision of someone cataloging everything for later use. Then he said something else shorter, and his eyes came down the street to where I was standing, and the look was different from the previous looks, not assessment, not calculation, just acknowledgement. The look of someone who has lost a particular engagement and knows it and is already thinking about the next one. Then he and the 12 people began the process of withdrawing. The UV arrays folded down on their mobile units and trundled after. The footsteps on the cracked pavement faded. Kalindra walked back to where I was. We stood in the street, both of us looking at where Krast had been. "He's not done," I said. "No," she agreed. "The 48 hours buys time. What comes after needs to actually work." "The filing is comprehensive," she said. "The council contact situation is, I won't tell you there's no risk, but the documentation is strong. And the inside person will be identified in the open council record within 48 hours, she said. Once identified, their access is terminated. Without the access, the review process reverts to its standard timeline and standard protections. Standard timeline being 8 to 12 months, during which Section 47 continues to apply. I nodded. From somewhere in the northeast ruins, from the ember-warm dark where the burrow kept itself, I heard a sound. Not the child's scream, not that, something very different. Something that I realized. After a moment, I was recognizing from a context I hadn't known I'd absorbed until right then. The sound Vethara made in their rest state, when they allowed the bioluminescence to run steady and warm. A sound that accompanied the amber glow. Except this wasn't the rest state. This was the waking version of that same sound. This was the sound of something that was alert and present and not afraid. I turned toward it without thinking. The glow was visible from the ruins. Not in one spot, but in several, here and there and there and there. The Vethara of the old burrow, the ones who had retreated from 3 waves of expansion and had made their lives in the condemned structures and the deep places, were showing their lights. Not hiding, not running. Just showing their lights. Kalindra was standing very still beside me. "They trust you," she said, very quietly, as if the saying of it was itself a careful act. "They trust the outcome," I said. "Both," she said. I didn't argue with her this time. Part 4, what the light looks like from inside. The 48 hours were not easy. I'm going to tell you that plainly, because the version of this story where those hours are a clean procedural exercise in watching the right systems work correctly would be a lie, and I didn't survive those years by lying to myself about what things were. Krast didn't go home and wait for the legal process to resolve. Krast went home and made calls, and the people he made calls to made calls. And somewhere in those chains of calls, the decision was made to not wait for the 48-hour holding period to expire, to try, in the interim, to discredit the filing, to challenge the encryption pathways on the transmission, to suggest, through channels that were careful enough to leave no direct fingerprints, that the 3 council contacts who had filed for review had done so based on communications from a non-human party with a vested interest in the outcome, which, while technically true in the most reductive possible framing, was an accusation designed to activate the reflexive institutional skepticism toward Vethara-originated information that, as I said, nobody on the outer rim was proud of, but everyone was aware of. The bureaucratic counterpressure was significant. The 3 council contacts held, barely in 2 cases. The third held more firmly, and I later found out that the third was a woman who had grown up in an early settlement, and had a specific history with Vethara-human coexistence questions that gave her the kind of personal context that made the institutional skepticism rebound off rather than stick. Kailindra was in communication, constant during those hours, with contacts I never fully identified and didn't ask to. She came through the burrow perimeter each night to update me. The second night, she brought Thessaly. The child was completely healed. The burns were gone. She moved with the careful, slightly too precise gait of a Vethara child, the thing that looks like extreme formality in Vethara youngsters, but is, apparently, just the normal developmental phase where they're learning to calibrate how much of their instinctive movement pattern to surface around other species. She looked at me for a long time from behind Kailindra's shoulder. Then she came out from behind the shoulder and stood in front of me and said, with the solemnity that only Vethara children and very tired adults manage, "Kailindra says you did a brave thing." "Kailindra is being generous," I said. "She doesn't do that," Thessaly said, with the confidence of someone who knew their source material very well. I glanced at Kailindra, the not quite amusement. "Then maybe she's right and I was just doing my job," I said. Thessaly considered this with the gravity of a judge weighing a complex precedent. "My mother says the difference between brave and just doing your job is whether it cost you something," she said. "Smart mother." "Yes," a pause. "Did it cost you something?" "Some sleep," I said, "and probably some paperwork." She thought about this. "That's not much." "It's not over yet," I said. She nodded, apparently satisfied with this as an answer to her actual question, which was not about sleep or paperwork. "She likes you," Kailindra said, when Thessaly had gone back into the ruins. "She's sizing up whether I'm worth the trouble," I said. "Same thing," she said. The 48 hours ended at 06:17 on what the Outer Rim calendar called a Wednesday. The Council filed the open record simultaneously across all Settlement Authority legal channels. The inside contact, whose name was not made public for 72 hours, which is a mercy I've never been sure the Accord intended or just allowed, had their access terminated automatically. The commercial interests behind Krast's funding were documented. The designation review was suspended pending a full investigation that would take, as Kailindra had projected, 8 to 12 months. Section 47 continued to apply. I was in the post when the confirmation came through. The post commander came to find me, which was unusual. He was a man who communicated primarily through written orders and considered personal appearance in someone's workspace to indicate a level of seriousness that he rationed carefully. He stood in the doorway and looked at me for a moment. "There's a council investigation that will want your incident reports from the last 31 days, he said. "I can provide those." "There will also be," he said, choosing words with the care of someone picking through something that might not be stable, "questions about certain aspects of your patrol conduct during the period covered." "I expect so." "I want you to know," he said, "that I have reviewed those reports. I am prepared to characterize your conduct as consistent with the standard requirements of the patrol assignment, with specific reference to the lawful protection provisions applicable in the designated patrol zone." It was the most he could offer. It was more than I'd expected. "Thank you," I said. He nodded once, looked at the wall above my head as if checking it for structural integrity, and left. The investigation took 4 months. During that time, I remained on patrol duty in the old borough. Nobody formally reassigned me, which was either an oversight or the post commander's way of keeping me where I was while things shook out. The investigation found my conduct within the parameters of lawful duty. The obstruction filing that Krast had threatened evaporated when the provisional clearance document was found to have been processed through the compromised inside access, which made the document itself procedurally invalid from the moment it had been issued. Krast's operation lost its off-world funding when the commercial connection became public. Not immediately, these things don't happen cleanly, but over the course of the investigation, the money dried up. The last time I heard his name, it was in the context of a different Outer Rim settlement, a different specific project. People like Brennan Krast don't stop. They relocate. The project finds a new host. But for the old borough, it was over. The designation review was eventually closed, the designation maintained, The commercial development interests redirected by the Settlement Council to undeveloped land on the northern frontier. The borough stayed. I was reassigned 8 months later back to the inner settlement zone. Standard rotation, nothing to do with anything. On my last patrol night, I went around the eastern corner and she was standing in the middle of the path. Same place as the first time, hands slightly away from her body. "You knew I was being rotated," I said. "I have sources," she said. "I know you have sources." We stood in the middle of the path for a moment. The sky was doing its perpetual early morning thing. "I want to tell you something," she said. "And I want to tell you in a way that is not formal, not as advocate." "All right." She took a breath, the particular kind of deliberate breath that someone takes when they've been thinking about something for a long time and have finally decided to say it. "The Accord has a word for what you did," she said. "Not for the specific actions, the patrol, the citations, the transmission, for the pattern of it, the decision that was made and remade across 31 nights." "What's the word?" "There isn't a standard translation," she said. "The closest approximation is something like choosing to remain in a position that could have been exited, not because exit was unavailable, but because remaining was what the situation required." "That's a very long word." "It's not one word. It's a concept. In your culture," I said carefully, "that's significant." "In any culture," she said. "But yes, in mine." A pause. "The child who walks beside someone in our understanding is not less than the one they walk beside. They are the presence that makes the walking possible, the thing that completes the trajectory." I thought about one who walks beside, the actual translation of her title. "You said the Accord has a word for it," I said, "but you're telling me this as not advocate." "I'm telling you this," she said, "because you didn't ask for anything. You didn't ask for the stones Thessaly left for you. You didn't ask for the explanation of the borough's history. You didn't ask for my presence on the patrol or the technology or the contacts or any of the things I brought. You accepted them and used them and kept walking." "You needed a person who'd keep walking," I said. "I needed," she said, "exactly the thing you turned out to be, yes." Something in her expression was doing something that I'd been learning to read over 31 nights and wasn't entirely sure I'd gotten right. Not the formal precision, not the not-quite amusement, not the watchful silver or the ember warmth. Something that was all of those things at a frequency they didn't usually run at simultaneously. "I will be based in Settlement Central for the next operational period," she said. "The investigation follow-up, the designation maintenance. There are many things that require an advocate's presence. Settlement Central is where my rotation is," I said. "I know," she said. "You said you have sources." I said I have sources. We looked at each other in the perpetual gray-blue light, with the borough running its rhythms around us. The skitter of debris from the northeast, the distant rumble of the transport grid, the soft amber glow visible if you looked at the right angle toward the ruins. "Kalindra," I said. It was the first time I'd used her name without the full formal designation. She didn't comment on it, but her eyes did the thing I'd been learning to read. "Darian," she said. "Also the first time, without the rank." "I'll be on the morning transport," I said. "I know," she said. "I finished the patrol." When I came around the full loop and reached the eastern corner again, she was gone, not dramatically, not traceless in a way that felt deliberate, just gone back to wherever she went when she wasn't standing in a patrol path waiting for someone who happened to keep walking. I stood there for one more minute. From the ruins, from the ember-warm dark of the borough, the glow was visible. Steady, slow, not the white of fear, not the silver of watching, the amber of something at rest. Something that had found, for the first time in a while, the conditions under which rest was possible. I've been asked, since then, to tell this story in a few different contexts. Once in a formal deposition, as part of the Council investigation's extended proceedings. Once in a retrospective published by the Settlement Accord's Documentation Division. Once by a journalist who was writing about Vethara human relations in the post-designation period and wanted a human perspective on what the old borough situation had felt like from the inside. Each time I've told some version of the same facts. But facts and story are not the same thing. Facts are what happened. Story is what it meant and what it cost and what it left behind. What it left behind. 5 stones in a small box on my workstation, the smooth from handling kind. A repaired left magnetic clasp on my boot. Kailindra noticed it on night 29 and procured a replacement component from somewhere that she declined to specify, and installed it with a precision that suggested familiarity with equipment maintenance that I hadn't expected from a coherence advocate. A working knowledge of Section 47 of the Outer Rim Settlement Code, including the specific applicability clause, which I've had occasion to cite in 3 subsequent situations in different deployment zones, each time watching the expression on the face of whoever was on the receiving end go through the same sequence of calculations that Krast's face had gone through in the old burrow. An understanding of Vethara bioluminescence states that is, according to the people I've mentioned it to at the Accord, more detailed than most human biology coursework covers. And Kailindra, that's a whole separate story, or the continuation of this one. I'm not entirely sure how to categorize it, and I've decided that not being sure is fine. She is precise still, formally precise in contexts that call for it, which are most of the contexts her work puts her in. She moves with the carefulness of someone who learned carefulness early and has never entirely unlearned it, doesn't want to unlearn it, considers it a form of respect toward the situations she's in. She still does the thing with her hands, slightly away from the body, the universal gesture of openness, when she's about to say something she considers important. She is also in context outside the formal. Surprisingly, I keep landing on the word dry, not the brittleness of someone who uses humor to keep people at a distance. The dryness of someone who finds the world genuinely, specifically absurd in ways they've spent a long time cataloging and occasionally share, with a precision of observation that makes you feel like you've been handed a perfectly calibrated tool and asked to look at something you've been looking at your whole life from a slightly different angle. She told me once, late at night in the settlement central office she uses when she's in the city, that she had been uncertain in those early patrol nights whether I was going to be a complication or a resource, that the distinction in her experience was not always immediately clear, that she had made a working hypothesis around night 26 and revised it upward on night 31. Revised upward, I said. Significantly, she said. What was the working hypothesis on night 26? That you were someone who did what they said they would do, she said. Which is rarer than it sounds. And after night 31, that you were someone who did what they said they would do, she repeated, even when the conditions changed. Still the same thing. Still, she agreed, just confirmed. Thessaly is 12 now, by the Vethara's reckoning of her development, which corresponds approximately to 8 or 9 in human terms. She visits Settlement Central sometimes, when she and her family make the trip from the burrow for what the Accord calls Accord Days, the designated interaction periods between Vethara and human community representatives that came out of the post-investigation reforms. She has completely stopped being shy. That's the most precise way I can describe the transformation. She was, in the courtyard, a child who had been made small by fear and circumstance. She is now a child who takes up exactly as much space as she's decided she's going to take up, which is quite a lot, and who has opinions about everything, which she shares with the careful precision that all Vethara bring to language and the absolute lack of filter that all children have not yet learned to install. She told me on the last Accord day that she has decided she is going to be a coherence advocate when she is grown. Like Kailindra, I said. Better than Kailindra, she said, with the serene confidence of someone who has assessed the field and reached a conclusion. Does Kailindra know this? She helped me write my development plan, Thessaly said. I looked across the room at Kailindra, who was in the middle of a conversation with 2 settlement council members, and who did not look up but who, I had the distinct impression, was monitoring the exchange in my peripheral vision with the watchful silver of her eyes, and the expression that was doing what her expressions always did when she'd been precisely, deliberately, elaborately correct about something. She doesn't do generous, Thessaly had told me, age 7 and sitting behind Kailindra's shoulder in the old burrow. She does something better, it turns out. She does accurate. She looks at a situation and she sees it the way it actually is, not the way fear or hope or institutional reflex wants it to be. And then she makes decisions based on what she actually sees. It turns out that when someone like that decides you're worth standing beside, it is perhaps the most particular kind of compliment available. Not because of what it says about you, because of what it says about them. The last thing I'll tell you is this. I went back to the old borough once. Not on patrol, I was off deployment by then, in the settlement's central rotation, working a different kind of assignment. But I went back on a day off, walking, the way you sometimes go back to places that mattered. The borough was the same, mostly, still not rebuilt, still not developed. The remediation process was moving slowly, not maliciously, just bureaucratically, which is its own form of slowness. The walls still leaned together at the top like they were sharing secrets. The transit wall along the northern edge still had the same quality of exposure that made you feel watched from all angles simultaneously. I went to the courtyard, the one with the rusted water feature skeleton and the broken benches and the mosaic. The mosaic was different. Not cleaned exactly, not restored, but someone had cleared the debris from the parts that had been buried, and the full design was visible now for the first time in, it looked like years, maybe decades. The design turned out to be much larger than I'd guessed from the fragments. It covered most of the courtyard floor. A pattern of interlocking paths in deep blue and pale gold. The paths meeting and diverging in a way that was clearly intentional, clearly meaningful, clearly a language I didn't speak but could feel the structure of. In the center where the paths all met, a shape, not a symbol I recognized from human iconography, a Vethara symbol old by the look of the tilework. I didn't know then what it meant, and I made a note to ask Kailindra. When I asked her later, she looked at the photograph on my communicator for a long moment. "It's the navigational marker symbol," she said. "I told you the mosaic was laid to mark the courtyard as a gathering node, a place where paths met. And the specific symbol in the center. A pause, the not quite amusement, and the something under it. In old Vethara," she said, "it's the symbol for the concept I told you about, the one without a clean translation." She looked at me with the watchful silver and the something under that. The one whose approximation is choosing to remain in a position that could have been exited because remaining was what the situation required. I looked at the photograph. Then I looked at her. "Someone laid that mosaic," I said, "before the courtyard was a courtyard." "Yes. Before any of this happened." "Yes." "So the symbol was always there," I said. "Under the debris, under everything that had been built on top of it and broken on top of it, waiting." "The symbols we make," she said, "tend to survive the circumstances that produced them. That's why we make them." Outside, through the settlement central window, the sky was doing a version of the perpetual gray-blue that the inner settlement sky does, different from the outer rim version, less charged, less of the copper smell, but similar enough. I thought about a shelf in my head, full of sounds I'd filed away. I thought about the sounds that never made it there, the ones that stayed on the floor in the middle of everything and waited. I thought about a child backed against a wall, asking why it mattered. I thought about the answer I still didn't have completely, and the life I was living in the direction of finding it. Some questions don't get answered, they get inhabited. You move into them and arrange your furniture and make them livable and wake up inside them every morning, and they stop being questions you're trying to solve and become, the shape of the space you occupy, the structure of where you choose to stand.